Welcome to Nasdaq Trade Talks. I'm Jill Malandrino, Global Markets Reporter at Nasdaq. Joining me is Erika, Deputy General Counsel at Nasdaq, to discuss why public companies are good for the economy and good for America. Erika, it's great to have you with us. Welcome to Trade Talks.
Hi, Jill. Thanks so much for having me.
In a time of coronavirus closures and economic uncertainty, why are public companies more vital than ever?
Well, they are. Thanks for bringing up that point. And it's because public companies are a vital source of both jobs and economic growth for ordinary Americans. The average American may not realize it, but through their 401k plan or their pension, they're probably invested in hundreds of public companies. And so therefore, for their retirement security, it's important that those public companies do well. Nasdaq has been focused on this issue for years. It's no secret that there's been a decline in the number of public companies in the last 20 years. And we think now with coronavirus and the economic turmoil resultant from that, it's more important than ever for all the stakeholders and especially regulators to look at ways to improve the public markets. We at Nasdaq published about 3.5 years ago a blueprint about how to do that. It's founded on 3 pillars: modernizing market structure, promoting long-termism, and reconstructing the regulatory environment. And we're very pleased that there has been some action on that last pillar in the last couple months, and we are hopeful for more action in the next few months as well.
The SEC recognizes the need to incentivize more companies going public and has proposed a series of reforms to revitalize markets. Tell us more about that.
Sure. I think in a minute we'll talk about the biggest reform which the SEC proposed or actually adopted last week, which was reform of the proxy advisory industry. I will say that in addition to that, there are a couple of other exciting rule proposals out there that Nasdaq is supporting and that we're hoping to see action on in the next few months before the election. Those relate to shareholder proposals and disclosure streamlining. On shareholder proposals, that's a mechanism that shareholders can use to send a company a proposal and have the company include it in its proxy statement for action by other shareholders at an annual meeting. It sounds great in theory, and it is, but in practice, it's been abused by smaller groups of shareholders, usually special interest groups or gadfly investors. And what we're suggesting here is that the SEC put some simple guardrails up so that companies don't have to waste time and resources fighting these proposals to protect their other shareholders. The other initiative that we're supporting and that we're cautiously optimistic to see some action on is disclosure streamlining. The SEC has a couple of proposals out there to modernize Regulation FK. One proposal relates to financial disclosures and the other to non-financial disclosures. And both of the SEC's reforms advocate for principles-based disclosures that are grounded in materiality, which is something Nasdaq has long supported. And we think that that would reduce compliance burdens for public companies, but also continue to protect investors. So we're excited about what's been done, and we think there are some great developments, hopefully in the works for the next couple months.
Erika, let's go back to proxy advisory firms for a minute, because as you said, they act on behalf of everyday shareholders who are unable to attend and vote at shareholder meetings, but they're actually standing in the way of some of these reforms. And that does sound counterintuitive. So more specifically, what's the issue with proxy advisory firms?
Sure, and this is something Nasdaq has been working on for almost a decade. We've gotten feedback from our listed companies, but also from stakeholders in the market. And what we understand and see is that there are 3 issues with proxy advisory firms that the SEC's proposal thankfully has addressed. The first is accuracy of their reports. There have been numerous examples of public companies pointing out errors in these reports. It can be anything from something so simple as a director's age to something that actually impacts an investor's vote at a company's annual meeting. And we just think there should be protections there that if a public company notices an error in a report, that there's a way to correct it. The second issue with proxy advisory firms is around conflicts of interest. Many people don't know that these firms, on the one hand, they advise investors, they recommend how investors vote at companies' annual meetings, but on the other hand, they provide consulting services to the companies, telling them how they can get an affirmative vote at their annual meeting. So to us, that seems like a bit of a conflict, and we just feel like there should be a little more transparency about that. And then the final issue is that because proxy advisory firms have so much power, they've become kind of like a shadow regulator. And we hear from public companies that they feel like they have to follow proxy advisory firms' policies, even though those policies haven't been subject to any kind of notice and comment period like a public rulemaking would. So we think because of that, proxy advisory firms have an outsized influence on corporate governance in the US, and they should be subject to some extra regulation. And we're pleased to say that the SEC, in its rule amendment last week, has addressed all three of those issues, and we commend it for doing so.
And Erika, to wrap up here, let's talk about Nasdaq's holistic point of view, because you had pointed out before, whether many Americans are aware of it or not, these kinds of issues do impact their 401ks and retirements, and public companies employ tens of millions of Americans.
That's exactly right. And we think that given that, and given all the turmoil in the markets in the last few months with COVID and with the economic impacts of it, now is the time to look at these reforms. They've been studied, they've been commented on, and we encourage the SEC to look at this as a package. The work that they did last week on proxy advisory firms was great, but in order to really improve the market, they need to continue, and we encourage them to focus on shareholder proposals and disclosure streamlining next, and we're cautiously optimistic and look forward to that.
All right, Eric, appreciate you sharing the insight on Trade Talks. Thanks for joining us.
Thank you.
And thanks for joining me. I'm Jill Malandrino, Global Markets Reporter at Nasdaq.